The moment Hartosh's feet hit the compressed dirt that made up the ground of New Hope, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. His moment of respite was brief, as 2 armed guards came up to him and began to lead him somewhere. The compound seemed to be on complete lockdown. To say that the appearance of his previous escort caused a stir would be an understatement. Every soldier there was ready for war. The guards dragged Hartosh into the command building, where they found an empty room in which they sat him down on the lone seat in the room. There most definitely would be an interrogation, possibly even punishment for getting himself captured. Hartosh's train of thoughts was cut short when the third-clawed Dantash burst in. Without hesitation, Hartosh stood up firmly on his feet and saluted the general. Dantash waved his hand for Hartosh to be seated, then kicked the guards out of the room, before finally turning to Hartosh to speak. I need to know everything that's happened to you from your capture to your return. I need details of what you saw, what equipment they face. I need to know what we're up against. Hartosh stayed silent for a few moments before thinking of what he was going to say. Sir, I was captured by a squad of 8 ISVA. It is likely that this is their standard number of soldiers on a patrol. Their weapons seem to be small and have no visible steam core, suggesting that they seek strength in numbers rather than firepower. Half of them had different pattern uniforms. I do not know why that is. It could mean anything. They took me to their base, which was several miles from my capture point. The ISVA base had, as far as I could tell, light defences, a few towers with mounted weapons surrounding the base. This was all that defended it. However, when I was leaving, they seemed to be setting up a barrier around the base. They were working quickly, so it's likely it'll be finished by next morning. The door opened violently, and in walked the head scientist, Chilukik. A brief pause was followed by Chilukik, motioning for everyone to continue. Their numbers were large. I estimate several hundred, perhaps more. It's hard to say. Upon entering the base, they put me into some kind of steel building where they stripped me of my weapons and gear. I was led to an area where warm water flowed and was soaked thoroughly. They did a physical inspection, taking fur and blood samples from me afterwards. Sometime later, they took me into a room not too dissimilar to this room and tried to communicate with me. I refused to cooperate for some time until my hunger got the best of me and they tempted me with rations. The way they heated the rations was like magic. They just put it into a bag and poured water into it, and it heated up. If they can do something like that with just a little bit of water, who knows what else they're capable of? Chilukik interjected. You said they were trying to communicate with you. How much of their language have you learned, or vice versa? Other than communicating very basic information like hunger, sleep, exercise, not much. I did find out that they call themselves humans. Their females and males are very easily distinguishable, but that is the extent of what I know about them. After a couple of days, they loaded me into a machine and took me here. Chilukik turned to Dantash and whispered into his ear. I would like to take him to the crash flying machine to see if he recognizes anything about it. Dantash looked at Hartosh before looking back at Chilukik with a stern face. I'll allow it, but if he does, then I want to know anything and everything immediately. Of course, I would do nothing to jeopardize your operation. The sarcasm in the air was thick, but Dantash didn't seem to pick up on it, or he hid it so well. Chilukik turned to the door and pounded on it a couple of times. After a few moments, one of the guards opened the door. Yes? Take me and this scout to the crash site of the ISVA flying machine. The guard looked at Dantash, who gave a nod. The 2 guards walked into the room and to either side of Hartosh and stood him up and followed Chilukik out of the door. As they left the building, they could hear the general issuing orders. I want double patrols across the base and an evacuation of all non-military personnel. We are at green alert. Outside, New Hope seemed to be returning to order, although there were still many soldiers running around. They approached a large metal object that lay near the base. As they grew closer, Hartosh could easily tell it was of ISVA origin. The pristine glass and advanced metalworking were a dead giveaway. Hartosh placed his hand on it and slid across it. This is one of their flying machines, you said? Yes, it crashed it early this morning. A ball began to form in Hartosh's gut. They had as many of these as the wheel machines. That meant they could transport an entire army by air, putting them on par with the Veek. Hartosh was used to the Dakar being beaten down by the Veek. The war had been raging for most of his life, but this was different. The Veek were technologically inferior, and their capability of flight was a gift of nature forged in a nested egg. This beast wasn't of evolutionary luck. This was designed, built, and flown via overwhelming technological advantage. What other horrors were these ISVA capable of? Hartosh dropped his hand from the machine and took a step back. I recognize it. These were at the ISVA base, but I didn't know that they could fly. Chilukik was visibly disappointed by Hartosh's answer, but before he could reply, an officer approached from behind. Once he arrived, he turned to Chilukik and spoke. Head Scientist Chilukik, you are to report to the patrol. You as well, Scout. May I ask why? Chilukik questioned. You're getting sent back over and your position is revoked indefinitely. General Datash will be your temporary replacement. Chalukik has an expression of shock, his mouth slightly agape. His expression quickly turned to anger and he clenched his fist as he looked as if he was about to boil over. Chalukik took a moment to gather himself and he released his fists. Tell them that I'll be over there momentarily. The officer nodded, then turned and walked away. Soon after the officer was out of earshot, Chalukik turned around and shot his fist into one of the metal panels of the instrument machine. His knuckles began to turn crimson as blood flowed down his fingers and dripped onto the ground. Hartosh, you may head to the portal now. I will be there momentarily. The guards then grabbed Harstock and began walking him to the large building in the centre of the outpost, leaving Chalukik alone, cursing under his breath. As much as Harstock hated this new world, he couldn't help but feel a little dismayed when entering the portal building. As he stood in front of the portal, a brief thought crossed his mind. Maybe he'd like to return someday. Harstock shook the thought. He must be going crazy. Without another thought, he stepped into the blue hue. He was finally home. Harstock was awoken by someone snapping fingers in his face, causing him to instinctively back away and jump to his feet. He took a moment to rub his eyes and orient himself. Dim lights offered some visibility, but not much more was needed, as Shishtakar's eyes were able to adjust to the rest. He was underground on the side of a street, and a military tram was sitting in the middle. Moss hung from the ceiling, a few moist droplets dripping every few seconds. Sharsier was always somewhat damp. Now he remembered. They were outside the lab waiting for transport and Harshot lay down on a bench. He must have been more tired than he thought and drifted off. The rhythmic hum of the steam turbines that power the industrial sector likely helped him fall asleep, as they did when he was a child. Yawning, Hartosh figured that the tram was his transport and stepped forward to board it. The tram system ran through the city and even ran above ground, but those tracks were strictly for military use. The civilian trams stayed below in the safety of the underground part of the city. Inside the tram it was cramped as the steam turret mounted at the back took up a good portion of the locomotive. Once Harstock had found a seat, one of his guards sat next to him, the other signalling to the driver that they were ready to move. Soon, a hissing of steam could be heard, and the tram began to move and pick up speed. It was late, past the mandated curfew, so the normally cramped streets of Charcier were eerily quiet and devoid of life. Every building here was carved out of the rocky underground with a purpose and function. Space was the greatest luxury down here. One on top of another, and no gaps in between. The houses and buildings were stacked closely together. Initially confusing at first, some of the houses go deeper into the rock, small alleys being dug to reach them from the main thoroughfare. Structural integrity is crucially important, lest the whole thing collapses onto itself. This makes building permits heavily regulated, and one of the hardest things to obtain. This is perhaps what has saved them, however. An attempted invasion of this maze with a Veek would be catastrophic. Fighting in small corridors where the defenders hold every advantage, some tunnels not large enough for a full wide span. Instead, the Veek strategy had been focused on starving them out. After a couple minutes, the tram went into a slight incline and exited the underground part of the city. The fresh and crisp mountain air hit Harstock. Until then, he hadn't realised how great it was to be back to his home world. He pressed the back of his head to an open window behind him, feeling the cool air rush through his fur. It almost made him fall asleep again. His moment of bliss was soon ended by the tram's brakes locking up, lurching him to one side. Harstock looked out his window to see the surface of the mountain. Strewn across the face of it, hundreds of now uninhabited buildings cover the mountain. These are old now. Some of the very first buildings built when they were forced to retreat from their former cities in the continent's lowlands. Damaged from Veek attacks, most of these are now simply empty shells, the inhabitants gone further underground. The army use them now, as barracks for rapid deployment to the surface, or for scouts to lay in ambush during Veek raids. Looking below the mountainous city, a large gated wall connected with the base of the mountain. Positioned along the wall were steam turret towers and light beacons. Of course, Harstock knew where they were headed. He'd been there countless times before. At the bottom of the hill sat the capital city military base, Fort Charcier.